Welcome to the program. I'm doing this program Monday through Friday, 12 noon and on. And of course, today I've got two guests. I've got John Gist, who is joining us right now, and I've got Dooovid coming up in hour number 2. Before I introduce my guest, let me give out the phone number. We are live and we're taking calls. Please keep your comments within the context of propriety and community standards. 617-396-4958, 617-396-4958. Let me welcome John Gist. He is a columnist. He posts his columns up on LinkedIn, writes for Crisis Magazine. His latest column, Nature's God and the Threat to the West. John, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So you write on Catholic theological and philosophical issues from that standpoint, and I guess let's start by identifying the Catholic understanding of nature of natural law. That would be a good place to start. And nature's God.
Okay, natural law, to keep it sort of, it can get pretty thick there, and I don't want to go too thick into it, but we'll just take it fairly basically and realistically. I think what I'm trying to get to in the article is realism versus idealism to a large extent. And natural law for Thomas Aquinas, of course, is the go-to guy on this, although a lot has been written about it over the Augustine, and everybody else has touched upon it. But the natural law is not the divine law. It's the natural law that we see operating all around us all the time. And for Aquinas, you can sort of draw analogies from that into human law, which is a different thing. But it's not a radically different thing. It's derivative. As I said in the article, I think that a lot that's going wrong these days, a lot of the confusion is because of the ambiguity of the language. And this starts with it's been around for a while, and they were actually probably correct in beginning to critique this. And you have deconstruction, you have critical theory, you have Nietzschean sort of nihilism, and all of them, even with Hume and these skeptics, even just say skeptics in general, they find the gaps in language and exploit it, because language in and of itself is not complete. I mean, there's always going to be some holes in any argument, and they tend to exploit those because they've boiled it down now to they think that language is only about power. It has nothing to do with reality. Language itself is a human construct. It's an ideology that has nothing more than to do with who gets to tell the story and who gets to have power. And that it is disconnected from the natural law from which it emerges. Language emerges from nature. We don't create nature through language. Right. Language emerges through nature.
Well, I think that their particular theory, the critical theory, would be they would find Noam Chomsky in great disagreement with that. He's, besides being a man of the left and a political figure, he also is revered as sort of a major linguistics figure and author. And he believes that language did not evolve. It happened spontaneously, however that came about, which actually is consistent with the creation story, even though he would yell and scream if we said that to him. The idea of natural law, then, just to recap or to look at it a little differently, is that it runs consistent with the creation. It's also has two components in that it's the physical natural law, biology, geology, science of all sorts, earth science, that which is, but it's also an abstract set of beliefs and values that are determinate in nature to a certain extent, through observation, through reason, through intelligence, through education, that we can understand that which is natural to man, and that these ideas do exist universally and outside of the particular opinions and ideas of any one person or group. And that in a sense, when God gave Adam the ability to speak, because the first command in the Garden of Eden was for Adam to name all things, he gave him language. It happened instantaneously. it was the idea that it's what made man separate from all other things. It's what the moment when, I think in Judaism we say it's the moment when the soul entered into the human being, or when the Shekinah entered in, or the Greeks would say Logos entered in, that he became able to reason, use intellect, use mind, use conscience, use the ability to understand the universe, compile knowledge, and basically out of that came not only language but writing and all, and the arts and music and all of the abstract things that emanate from it. But at its core, it's the idea that we can identify existence. We can, categorize and analyze existence. And from that, we can perceive of moral law, what St. Thomas Aquinas might have referred to as natural law. Now, you talked, John, about the fact that, the critical theorists, they want to change the language. They want to find loopholes in language to craft their own messages. They want to change the meaning of words. And I think that there's a great history of that. This is what the Fabians were doing in England. They felt that, they were socialists, they were Marxists, but they didn't feel that England and Europe generally was ready for outright Marxism. Even the Communist Manifesto says in one of its planks that you had to fashion your Marxist agenda to the conditions of a particular society. So they felt that the best way to go about implementing socialism was to change the meaning of words, leave the words in place, but they would take on new meanings that could then be crafted to fit their agenda. And I think that it's safe to say, at least philosophically, if not literally, that the American institution that best reflects the Fabian institution in England, which still is there, was the ACLU. Because the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, established in the 1920s by an avowed Marxist, I might add, they would leave the laws in place, they'd leave the Constitution in place, but they would change what these words actually meant in practice to fit their agenda. So talk a little bit more about that phenomena, changing of the meaning of words.
I think we can trace it back, and we've talked a little bit about this before, but this is a long, like you say, this has a long history. It stretches way back. And it also stretches back into the Catholic Church with the Franciscan Ochman, and sort of this idea of the nominalist approach. You did thank you for that summation of natural law. That was better than I could have done. So, you mentioned that we sort of have a correspondence theory of truth where we think that, I'm talking about realists, think that in pertaining to natural law, you can actually, language corresponds with reality when it's true. When you say something true, it actually corresponds with reality. Nominalism, and so there are these universals. There's these things that's about transcendence. At the end of the day, there are things higher than human beings that would go on whether human beings were here or not. It doesn't take us to observe them for them to exist. There are universals such as human nature, things like this. Nominalists come along and they challenge that. Now, Occam didn't really mean to cause the stir that he caused, but he planted the seed of there are no universals. Those are pure abstractions. Those are pure human constructs that we're trying to imprint upon reality rather than what reality is in of itself. And I see this as the big move. And to put it sort of dramatically, it's a move of hubris where we're trying to, you can see this all the way through history, move a little bit further away from the concept of God to the concept of man. And so if you break off, there are no universals, humans get to create the reality through their language. One of these, of course, is socialism. And you're also absolutely correct about leaving the language in place, but that's why everybody's confused these days, because you hear things like equity and all. I mean, you could go through a whole bunch of this stuff. and you're going, I don't even know what they're talking about. I don't know what this means anymore. Nothing makes sense to me. And they're doing that on purpose to norm you a little bit. So it's the common language, but they're trying to change the actual meaning and to create these utopias. But we've been through this game before too. And the 20th century was a terribly bloody, horrible century of people trying to create utopias, not create them, but force them on reality.
Right.
But the reality suggests that man is a fallen creature, and people have known this since day one too. It seems like it goes through the literature, but they just can't accept it.
Well, they want to perfect man using replace God and make a perfected man. It's what Whittaker Chambers called the battle between God and man. And then he referred to communism as the world's second oldest religion. The idea that man can supersede God, man can know all things, overthrow God, and create some kind of a international ant colony is what they want to do. But what was you mentioned Occam. What was Occam's razor?
That's useful, and I don't want to disparage Occam completely, because when he was he had trouble with the Franciscans. He had a little bit of trouble with the church too, but he tried to get back to it. He wasn't trying to destroy anything. He was trying to, think his way through things. But Occam's razor it's useful. The simplest answer to a problem, the simplest solution, is probably the best solution. So we see just the opposite going on now. Everything is complex. Everything is so theoretical and abstract, nobody knows what's going on anymore. When really it's fairly, I think the problems themselves are fairly easy to spot what they are. So the solutions are probably fairly easy to state, although they're very difficult to achieve. Just like we hear all this disparagement of the United States and the 1619 Project and critical race theory raging, and there's getting a lot of pushback now, thank goodness. But these are all things that are trying to undermine the language of America and say that we're just all purely racist, which just isn't true. I mean, it's just not. They're not only trying to change meanings of words, they're trying to rewrite history again.
Oh, they are. It's completely bogus. I mean, the 1619 Project makes reference to the American Revolution which was a result of the British trying to abolish slavery. There's not a shred of truth. There were abolitionists in America. I mean, Alexander Hamilton was an abolitionist. And by the time the American Revolution rolled around, at least half of the states had abolished slavery. The British didn't get around to abolishing slavery until the 1830s, thanks to the efforts of Christian activist William Wilberforce. They did do it before the United States, which took a civil war, but there was no evidence that the British were interested in abolishing slavery. If anything, they were profiting from slavery with the triangle trade, and they forced Georgia to accept slavery by refusing to recognize their government and threatening to send in the militia unless they did, which they did do about maybe 50 years before the American Revolution. So that is a completely bogus piece of history. Now, the issue of equity versus equality, we always understood from the civil rights movement the idea of equality. It was discussed by the late, great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that all men are created equal under God. Men and women are created in God's image, according to the book of Genesis. But they're talking now about this idea of equity as opposed to equality. So what exactly do they mean? Because again, this is the use of language to mean different things and, put in different emphasis. So what is equity?
Well, it's another, and the way they employ it, it's rather ambiguous in itself, because, when this started first appearing in the news cycles and the critical race theory and all this stuff, I was confused. I was going, what? I don't understand how they're using this word equity. That seems like they're just using it as a replacement to equality. They think somehow these are equal, but they're not. I mean, the equity is not, when we speak of equality, we're speaking of individuals are equal in the eyes of God. We're all created equally in the eyes of God and of the law. We're supposed to have equal opportunities to succeed. Now, again, that's an ideal. Nobody ever said that we've achieved that fully or anything else. We strive towards it, and slowly but surely we make progress to it. Will we ever get there completely? Doubtful. This is a fallen world. But the whole point is in the striving, not the achieving. But equity is they strip out that opportunity. There's no equal opportunity to achieve personal arete or excellence anymore. Everybody's the same. I don't know if you're familiar with the short story Kurt Vonnegut, Harrison Bergeron.
No.
It's a great little story, and everybody should go out and read it because it's entertaining as well as Kurt Vonnegut tended to be. But it's about this society that has achieved perfect, he uses the word equality. And the character, this sort of Nietzschean character, Harrison Bergeron.
All right, having a little technical problem here, but Jack, I hope that you can work that out.
A great ballerina, you have to wear weights on your legs. If you're beautiful, you have to wear a mask. If you're highly intelligent, you have to wear a buzzer in your ear. And so there's a rebellion. Harrison Bergeron rebels and is killed. But that's equity, where everybody has the same outcome. There's no more excellence. It's all mediocre at best, probably worse than that in the long run. That's equity as far as I can ascertain it.
Well, it's just a euphemism for communism. It's a euphemism for collectivism, which is the underlying goal of the entire communist movement going all the way back, which is that everyone becomes de facto equal. And if you want to create a world where that can happen, which is impossible because we all have different talents and different abilities. I mean, I'm not going to ever be as good a baseball player as Carl Yastrzemski was, right? I'm not going to probably be as good a historian as Henry Kissinger. I mean, everyone has their strengths and weaknesses. We're all different in the universe. So there's never going to be absolute equality. And the idea of trying to create that is wrong. It's bizarre. It runs against human nature. And it would require the abolition of all of the ideas and institutions that do make us unequal. The family, marriage, right? Love, property, the right to trade goods and services, the right to have loyalty to different organizations over others. All the normal and appropriate choices that we make every day of our lives make us unequal because we choose some things over others. That's exists in nature. Animals understand this. This is just the idea of trying to create equity, de facto equality. It's more than evil. It would be a universe that we could never recognize, and yet they continue to try to do this. This is what the communist movement was all about. This is what Nazism was all about. This is what any radical utopian movement tries to do. They're trying to create this utopia where everyone becomes de facto equal, and there are no longer any institutions that make us unequal or that in any way separate us. We become fused into one gigantic international brain where everything is the same, and where we are basically automatons. We're in tune with nature. I mean, Frederick Engels wrote about that, this idea that somehow being in tune with nature is socialistic. It's that we become natural. In other words, we no longer are human, we're animals.
But that's that's sort of a false narrative of this. In the article I read about, in the Constitution, is nature's God. And that's an Enlightenment idea of the social contract, where their nature is something totally radical. It's an abstracted nature that has no contact with humans. It's like no human has ever witnessed such a nature, because it would be free of human influence. So I think that Engels and all these, they say that this natural impulse, but it goes against natural law to a large extent. And there's another Catholic philosopher, John Duns Scotus, who gets in trouble. He's another Franciscan. He gets a little bit of trouble from the sort of the Aquinas people, because he doesn't agree totally with Aquinas, but he comes up with this idea of thisness, which is individual. It's radically individual. There's never going to be anyone like you ever again. Even if you're an identical twin and you're genetically identical, you're going to have different experiences and experience reality different. No two things are alike because of the power of God, basically. Now, that doesn't mean some radical individualism, some radical Nietzschean individualism or Hobbesian, where it's war of all against all for power. That means individuals who can express their potential, the Greek concept of arete, excellence, for the good of the whole. We always forget the common good in all of this. Individuals contribute to the common good. The common good is made up of individuals. Now, these socialists and communists, and maybe you can answer this, but because I don't really get it, what drives them to think that this is going to work? What possibly could motivate them, unless it is just some sort of abject grab for power? Because we've seen where they do impose it. Some people get very powerful and everybody else either gets killed or starves to death, it seems like. So I don't know if it seems like there has to be some good in some of these people where they really think that this can work, where we can just live in this sort of blasé, mediocre, no excellence, no individuality. I just don't understand how they could think that that would be a good thing. I don't know if you're familiar with the Borg Star Trek. I brought this up before, I think. Yeah. I've been rewatching those because the Borg are these people. They assimilate everything. There are no individuals. They're like a bee colony. And they say, you will assimilate, resistance is futile. I feel like that was sort of a prescient thing for Star Trek to do, because that's what we're under. But I don't understand what the motivating force. You meet some of these people and they're good people. I mean, they're not bad people or anything, but their ideas are, I don't understand the motivation, how you could conclude that this would be a good thing.
Well, you talk about the Catholic thinker Scotus and his idea of the individual, and it makes me think that when you have the paramountcy of the individual under God, created by God, sui generis, unique, every single life, and it's also very Talmudic, that every life is like its own universe and has a value because it is created in the image of God, that being every man and every woman. That part of that existence, sort of baked into that reality, baked into that existence, however it came about, is a natural idea of doing good for others. It's just there. Now, that doesn't mean that every single person does it, but it's a natural impulse to help your neighbor, starting with your own family and your own circle of friends and your own acquaintances and your own associates. And then it goes out in concentric circles to your community, to your state, to your nation, and ultimately to the world. It is a natural tendency for people to make contact with others, to help others in need. That's normal. That is a natural part of the human being, always has been, always will be. That's observable in nature. But the socialist wants to, first of all, they deny that. They run on this false dialectic, which insists that those who have more are involved in some kind of a conspiracy of greed, that they're motivated strictly by exploiting others. The only reason why they're successful is because they somehow ripped off someone else. It wasn't anything that they inherently did. This whole idea of exploitation. And that therefore, because they're not going to have this natural tendency to want to help others, that can only be done by the brute, gun-backed power of the state that has to be implemented. It is the state that is the only instrument that can actually help others. And in a way, it kind of lets the person off the hook. You no longer have to think about helping others because you just know you are by supporting the state. That is the state's job to do it, and that the state can implement it. Not that the state can't help others in a sort of, I would suggest, more passive way, and that the state ultimately is made up of people and it reflects the value of a community and it can coordinate helping others, but that it denies that inherent element of who we are, which is that we want to engage. It's part of our social being to do good and to help to help other people. Now, why is it that they support this brutal system? I mean, there's a lot of motivations. I think especially when people reach levels of power. Right now I'm studying sociology, and I'm reading C. Wright Mills' book, The Power Elite. He wrote it in the 1950s. He's seen as like this great figure of sociology. And he talks about how at that time, there were three nexuses of power in the United States: the military, the corporation, and the business, and the government. And that you had people at high levels in all of these three areas who tended to flock together, who tended to intersect, even though they often competed, and who all had a slightly utopian idea that because they were so successful, they could control everyone else and that they knew better than everyone else. Maybe it's a rather perverted understanding of doing good. It's based upon this false egoistic sense of their own power and their own importance, in the world. Somehow there was something about why they're so successful. They started actually believing that they're superior, that they're better than you. And so they then use the implementations of power, whether it be government, corporation, or military, to impose that will on others. And they feel they're doing it benevolently. Now, this has caused most wars in history. It has certainly caused the two big wars of the 20th century, the Holocaust, forced famines, depressions, a lot of horrendous human problems that were really manufactured by people in power. But today, and by the way, it has a lot to do with satanic influence. My latest book, the Satanic Conspiracy, deals with this. But lately, now in our own time, it's becoming particularly deadly and dangerous because of modern technology. Now they have the ability to, with artificial intelligence, with transhumanism, with the control over the scientific means of control, surveillance control, with them holding those kinds of levers, we're dealing with a much more dangerous, quote, conspiracy. And I use that word loosely. I'm not saying they're all sitting around in a smoke-filled room. It's just they have they are seeking to control others through means of force and deception. That's a conspiracy in the broad sense. It's a much more dangerous time, and we're dealing with a much more lethal enemy. And I would say they are enemies of individual freedom, the individual sovereign right of the citizen under God, created in the image of God, to understand how to help other people, to make up their own minds. Anyway, I don't mean to keep waxing here, but
no, but you're correct, and it's sort of in our face at this point. I mean, not to go name names or anything, but social media, as we've seen, I mean, this is just, anybody can see this. This is just factual, are censoring people because they think they have the better idea what's good and what's wrong. That they want to strip choice from the individual. Sort of in my way of looking at the world, we're here basically for one reason, and that is to choose. I think we have free will as a individual free will is almost what makes us human, and combined with reason to use it and everything like that. The whole problem is people use reason for the wrong reasons. Like I don't think these social media guys, which are really just gossip rags, if you think about it, they made billions of dollars off of social gossip, and more than anything else, that's what they are. They're not, I mean, they're technologically geniuses at the right place at the right time, but they're certainly not moral geniuses. They obviously haven't read anything from the wisdom traditions of East or West or anything else, because now they really do exhibit this hubris where they're challenging the gods. They think we can make a heaven on earth if everybody just does what they say. But I think it may be more insidious than that, because there is power involved. And I also agree with you that there are satanic influences. In the Catholic Church, we believe that the devil is a real thing. It's not just a a product of our imagination or a little story to tell children to scare them. It's a real thing. And when you start accumulating power, I think that you become a little bit more, not to say everybody that accumulates power falls prey, but a lot of them do, because you're reminded of the temptations of Jesus. I'll give you the world if you just do what I want you to do. And they see the world in front of them. They control vast amounts of information. I mean, so much information, they can predict the average person's next purchase almost to the key. I mean, it's sort of,
yeah.
It's sort of like Hannah Arendt said, it's banal, because really what they're just trying to do most of the time is, or they used to, or trying to get you to spend your money. We make money where you spend money, but now it's boiled over into more than that, where they want to control the way we think, our choices. We can choose what we want to on this earth while we live, and there's going to be consequences. But if you take away those choices, what are we? We're no longer human. We're no longer individuals. I think the United States, for all its flaws and everything else, is mostly good. The founding fathers' conception of the individual, the government was here to protect the individual, not vice versa. That's not to control us or tell us what to do. It's to protect our right to choose within reason. And from there's the other side of human nature that is not good. I agree with you totally that it goes back to that I can't remember the Chinese philosopher that went deeply into this. Either you're born evil, you're born neutral, or you're born good. I think we're born probably good, but we fall prey to all kinds of things. There's all kinds of things seeking to ruin us out there.
The satanic influence is everywhere. It's within us and it's around us. And the thing, we're all charged with asking ourselves and asking our fellow citizens to know God. And that's to say, to know good and to know truth, and then to measure their life against that, because we're all imperfect and we're all sinners. The satanic influence enters into the picture when you have an elite that claims that good is evil and evil is good. Yeah. When you are doing something that's wrong and that's bad, you should at least know that you are, and you've made a conscious choice, and then take the consequences of it. But the idea of pretending that it's suddenly good, or pretending that good is evil, or that there's no such thing as sin and there's no such thing as being good, that's where I think the satanic influence comes in, because it's a deception. And Satanism is an anti-natural. It's a deception against nature, and it only exists in the shadows, which is because once it's exposed and the truth is seen, it dissipates. Anyway, let me just, while we're on the topic, it's my show, so why not? Let me take a quick, the show is sponsored by me and my book. So let me hold up my book. This is The Satanic Conspiracy. It's available at Amazon Books. You could get it in softcover or ebook. It's selling fairly well for one of my books. I mean, I've written over 20 books. This one, people seem to like it. Let me hold it up for TikTok also. So The Satanic Conspiracy is available at Amazon Books. All right. So anyways, Jack, we're talking about your article, which you published. It's republished at LinkedIn, but it's crisismagazine.com, Nature's God and the Threat to the West. And in a nutshell, you're talking about the Fabian agenda, which is now being expressed in the form of critical theory, of changing the language, of using and manipulating words to fit an agenda. And that agenda, I think, as we've discussed, at least in this, I know we're being simplistic, but why not, is collectivism. The idea of surrendering your freedom as an individual under God to some kind of a bizarre, amorphous, mediocre collective, where ultimately we all become one gigantic beehive.
Well, I think that I haven't read that book of yours yet, but I will order it right after we finish up here, because I've had this boiling through my mind for a while now, and I don't know if you've experienced this, but I experienced this myself, that I don't want to sound crazy to people when I talk to them, but I really do think that there's a big satanic influence. And it's not the individuals. Like I said, I think there's somewhere in everybody, there's some good, but the people that are supporting these movements, they're taken over by something. Because it's exactly like you're saying. They're saying that the evil is no longer evil, or it's actually the good. And this is where you get all this identity weirdness, where people think that I saw watching the news the other day, I saw this, they put these things on because they find anything they can, but it was this transgender couple. And so the woman wanted to be the man wanted to be the woman or whatever. And they had a baby, I guess. But the man was actually trying to nurse the baby. And I'm going, oh my God. I mean, sometimes I don't know whether to laugh or it's just gone completely absurd. I don't know what to think. But I think that nobody knows what is good and evil anymore because they're confused. The tactic of these people is to confuse almost everybody. That's why they're ambiguous. That's why they won't take a stand. I got in a conversation once about safe places with some students. I think I mentioned this before, but it's a good example. The philosophy club challenged the gender equity club to a debate on safe spaces. And I advised the student, I just go, you have to define what a safe space is before you can discuss it. You have to have some sort of way to communicate it. They wouldn't define the space. They said it was completely subjective and it depended on the context, blah, blah, blah. And the guy that was arguing said, well, there's no point in having a discussion if we don't even know what we're talking about. But that's what they do. They don't want to make a hard definition. They don't want to take a stand on anything, because if they do, like you were saying, the light will shine upon it and the absurdity of the situation will dissipate, because the universe is reasonable, or else nature would not operate.
And the reason we have language is to make things reasonable by identifying their nature and what they are, and then advancing that knowledge. And it's kind of they're using what French scholar Elaine Benescon called the totalitarian language. It's the means of obfuscation, sophistism, the use of indirect terms, flowery terms, sort of half truths, kind of a parallel thinking, and an that you find that's typical of most leaders. Most politicians do this because they don't want to offend anyone. They don't say this because that group they won't vote for you. So you develop this really almost code language that it says very little. I remember President Clinton's Secretary of Human Services, Donna Shalala. I probably wouldn't agree with her politics, but she went on, I think, to become president of a university. But she was asked, how do you feel about your arrival in Washington? What are your impressions? And she said, well, the first thing I learned is that a good politician can say nothing, but do it beautifully and in length and at length. And in a way, there's a subtle aspect to that, in that when we hear that kind of language, especially when it comes from leaders, we sit back and we're like, oh, that's so brilliant. I don't understand it, but it's so incredible. And yet when you walk away from that, I know of a rabbi that does this. I'm not going to mention names, of course, but you don't know what the heck they talked about, but it sounded good. You might have been half asleep during the whole thing, but it's like it's great kind of frosting. It's and that's what they do. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why Donald Trump was so successful and why they feared him and hated him. This is because he spoke bluntly, not always artfully. Sometimes he'd be wrong, but at least he knew what was on his mind. It kind of came out in simple, basic terms. And that's revolutionary in this day and age, to be like that, to speak like that in plain English, plain language.
Yeah, I've sat around my share of academic meetings, and there's a lot of people that think they're speaking eloquently and saying nothing, but they're just saying nothing, and your blood starts to boil. And they do. If you just challenge them and go, just ask a blunt question, the whole room kind of doesn't like you to do that. They don't really like you to do that because you're disrupting. And one reason this is sort of working, I think, in America it's sort of a imposed identity crisis on everybody, and everybody. It's a basic human emotions. We are a communal animal. We're not rabid individualists. We don't live in alone, no man is an island type stuff. So we want to belong. Everybody wants to belong to somebody, to some group. But it used to be you went to church, or you went to the synagogue, or you went to whatever you went to, and you might identify with a group that way. But now it's just to accidentals. It's to the color of your skin, who's in power. Are you oppressed? Are you the oppressor? And it's banal in one sense, because it's just so basic. I mean, you really are going to try to reduce a human being to the color of their skin. All that's degrade their experiences, degrade their longings, degrade everything about them to the color of their skin, or to whatever transsectional oppression they're having. A lot of this, I think, is a war against the dignity of the individual who strives for the common good. And I think that's a basic foundation of America, individuals striving for the common good. Did we get it right all the time? No. Do we get it right now? No. But we try. And slowly but surely, we kind of do better.
Yeah, I mean, this has been the greatest and most benevolent society in history. And in a way, this entire paradigm, to bring it back to the topic of critical theory. And critical theory, by the way, I mean, critical race theory, there's also critical legal theory that came out of Harvard back in the 1980s. Professor Duncan Kennedy and a couple of other people, they were Marxists. Critical theory itself came out of the Frankfurt School at Columbia in the 1950s. It was a lot of the people that were involved in that were expatriate German Jewish intellectuals, sociologists, psychologists, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Erich Fromm. I think Wilhelm Reich was part of that, and they were Marxists, and they left Nazi Germany for good reason. I'm not saying they shouldn't have, but they set up shop at Columbia, and they wrote a series of books, and they did a series of research articles that influenced hugely, starting in the 1950s, where basically they said that the American system was false and a false consciousness, and that the American middle class was secretly fascist, is what I think Adorno's theory was. And that a lot of the stuff that we were was subconscious. We didn't know this is who we were, and that it's bad. And they really didn't say what they wanted to replace it with, but given their political orientation, we can surmise. They launched the sexual revolution. Certainly, Wilhelm Reich and Marcuse were as a means to sort of undermine logos, as the Greeks would say, as the Catholics would say. The order of society, the moral order that had developed over since really the beginning of time, and certainly that which was advocated by the ministry of Jesus. And the way to do that was to introduce sexual license and to say this was good, to declare this as liberated and as enlightened, and that if you continue to adhere to or advocate conventional sexual values, you were seen as prejudiced, and that there was actually something mentally wrong with you. I mean, Sigmund Freud was one of those people as well. He talked about polymorphous perversity as being the ultimate virtue in human society, which means that sexuality was whatever you wanted it to be at any time, with any person, in any group, in any way, anything goes. And that to contradict that was a psychological problem. In other words, you were mentally ill if you didn't believe this. And that was the zeitgeist of the critical movement. Now, the critical race theory is not something that I claim to really understand yet. I'm beginning to understand it, but from what I'm hearing from these people who are protesting it, and they're not necessarily conservative either. These are parents whose children, I saw this Black father got up, and I think it's particularly disliked, by the way, amongst African Americans, in that it is besides being racist and besides viewing people literally as by race, as if there's something biologically different between people based on their race, it's also anti-American. It's anti-property. It's anti all of the things that we adhere to because it claims that these things perpetrate racism. Um, Maybe it's in a way a symptom of the reduction of genuine racism in this country, in that, we have gotten rid of the old-fashioned legal racism, like Jim Crow laws and that kind of stuff. And that finally, the great stain on our history, which is racism, minorities are moving up in the world. They are becoming more middle class, particularly since Trump. They are becoming more productive. They are becoming more sovereign. They are taking advantage of all of the blessings and all of the benefits of being an American. And that racism is there, but it's certainly no longer the kind of real factor that it once was. It no longer prevents a person from obtaining an opportunity that they can achieve. And so that's why maybe they're inventing this thing, to keep it alive, to keep us divided. I don't know.
I think so. To go back to Marcuse, I mean, he was a rock star, and
Oh, yeah.
I think he was like in several universities, and
Sure.
he was like had a cult following. I mean, this guy was like a rock star. He really
Oh, yeah.
was. But their whole project, they were these weird Marxists that were puzzled that communism got stopped in Western Europe. For some reason, it stopped. And they sort of came to the conclusion that it was the Protestant work ethic, among other things, but they pick up and they put together like Freud and Nietzsche and all these and Marx, and they put them all into this clump and they create this monster out of them. And I think Solzhenitsyn said it better than anybody, and I'm going to paraphrase it grossly here, but he said communism is a soul hatred of God. That at bottom, that's what he saw it was. It was a hatred of God. And when we see BLM that fly under, that's another thing that sounds good. Black Lives Matter. Well, of course they do. I mean, that's of course they do. That's obvious to anybody, but that's not really what they're about. They were created by affirmed Marxists, and on their website for a while they had it. They were against the nuclear family, where all this stuff begins, like you were talking about earlier. The good, you want to do good for your neighbor. This begins at the home. You want to do good for your family. You want to do good, protect your family, nurture your family. The brothers and the sisters look out for each other. This comes in concentric circles outward to society. And they want to destroy the nuclear family and replace it with the state will tell you what is good and what is evil. And we've seen what they're throwing at us. They're throwing out very confusing sort of, it goes back to critical theory, sexual license. Basically, freedom is for them is freedom to do whatever you want, basically. Right. There's no duty involved in it. There's nothing
sacred.
Nothing sacred. I think that's what we're getting down to. For these people, There's nothing sacred except this weird idea that the state is sacred, which it can't be. Politics,
it's a force run by man. It's anti-God. I mean, we're not anarchists. We need a state, but the American philosophy is that the state is there to preserve and protect God-given rights. So, John, I'm getting requests on TikTok for people to find out who you are and for you to identify yourself. They really are impressed by you. So talk a little bit about what you're doing, where people can reach you, who you are.
Hello. Well, thanks for everybody that is inquiring. I'm Jack Gist, and I grew up in Wyoming. I'll give you the quickie here. Grew up in Wyoming, went to graduate school in Alaska, and have taught at a number of universities sort of on the frontiers. Right now I'm in rural New Mexico. And, I think the university is a weird thing to me for somebody of my ilk. So I'm trying to part ways. So I'm doing some writing on my own, and I'm going to offer my services to help others, because I think that there's going to be a renaissance of sorts in kind of, I don't know really how to phrase it, the literature concerning that has a sacred element or a transcendent element in it, because we really need to get past ourselves. We've become so consumed with being human that we've forgotten the things that are bigger than humans, bigger than any one person or anything else. And so I'm revivalwriting.com. I just launched a website. It's still a little bit rough, but I'm going to have a blog there, which I'll blog every week. I hope to keep in touch with Charles over the coming months and hopefully years, because we're on the same page on we're on the same wavelength on a lot of things. And it makes me, because I'm in a university, sometimes I think I'm crazy because I'm the only one that has the kind of ideas that I'm having.
Yeah.
But I've met a lot of good people out there in the world, like the editor for Catholic World Report. He's a really good guy. Crisis Magazine. There's plenty of good people left. So don't let them, just because they control the media, don't let them make you think that we're the tiny minority. I think we're probably the majority. We're just used to being quiet, to tell you the truth.
It's a growing movement all over the world. And also, I want to mention that a lot of TikTok people are asking me to talk about the breaking news regarding the Arizona audit. I can't talk about that because we're on TikTok. It's forbidden. So what I would suggest is that you go to the Gateway Pundit, excellent source. I also listen to Steve Bannon's War Room Pandemic on Apple, which is excellent. I try to listen to that every day. And those are the two excellent sources on information that is forbidden on YouTube. So I know what you're talking about. Yes, there is breaking news. Yes, it's good news for those of us who care about truth and freedom, but we can't talk about it on YouTube. All right, so I mean, doesn't that say a lot right there?
It does. It does.
We're not talking about something that's putting anyone at risk. We're talking about a political issue, an election. What could be more political than that? But you can't do it on YouTube because the people that are in control over there decided it's banned. And that's, by the way, something that I think ultimately will change due to legal case, actually a class action suit that is being brought against them, and one of whose main participants is a former president. Let's just put it that way. So anyways, John, going back to topic at hand here, the reaction by parents against the so-called critical race theory. I mean, they're saying, look, there are better ways in school to teach about racism and to try to reduce racism. Does anyone in their right mind think that critical race theory is going to reduce racism in this world? I mean, it's quite the opposite. It's creating collective views of people and hostility between them. And I saw a black parent get up and say, look, my wife happens to be white. She's the mother of my child, and he's being taught to hate his mother because she's white. And it actually said, oh, the white devil, and just this kind of stuff. It sounds like, in a way, it's not all that different than the sort of ideology of Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam, quite frankly. And these Moors, these radical groups, except in their case, it's black supremacy. I mean, they're complaining about white supremacy, which is something that is no longer a major issue in this country, frankly. It certainly was up until maybe the 1950s. And
I actually don't think it has anything at all to do with race. And I'm very happy to see, I've seen some of the clips of these, people need to storm their school boards, go in force and make sure you know what they're teaching your child. Mm-hmm. And if they're reluctant to tell you, that tells you a lot right there. And some of these people are very articulate. They're very outraged that they're teaching their children to hate, but I don't really think it has to do with race. As you alluded to earlier, it has to do with politics, and it has to do with Marxism. Marxists want chaos. They'd like to have chaos because then they can come in and into the vacuum and clean it up. It's the vacuum of power and claim it for their own. And this, all it does is sow chaos. The Beverly D'Angelo book, White Fragility. Who's the guy that writes for Rolling Stones? His name is escaping me. He's a big shot, though. He writes pretty good editorials, frankly. And he's definitely no conservative, but he said White Fragility must be the dumbest book ever written. And this guy's a liberal. I mean, it was the dumbest book that was ever written. And I tried to read it, and it's so noxious and doesn't say anything really at all. and the Kendi book of the how to be an anti-racist.
Anti-racism, yeah.
It starts on a false dichotomy. I mean, there's just no real reason for it to exist except to cause strife. That's all it's there for, is to cause strife.
And now he has set up an institute at BU, where I am in Boston, the Anti-Racism Institute. I mean, it's not to end, it's like a very kind of weird activist thing. Now, the professors, and you might know something about this, John, as a professor. I think that a lot of them were trained, or they went through a training at this institute in Bethel, Maine. This kind of, and speaking of critical race, I think it was established by critical theorists in the 50s, that actually trains teachers. They go up there for like a session, like a 4-week session, to how to diffuse opposition from the community, how to market certain things, how to hide certain things from the community. You know, they called, this is where the word change agent came out of. And I think I interviewed someone years ago about this. I'm gonna have to look it up and get back to that. But you know, you see this in action in these school board meetings where it's you know, it's the most fascist thing you can imagine. I'll give another example of this. I mean, I actually went to a school board meeting in Newton, Massachusetts, near where I live in Boston. This is a community that has a large percentage of Jewish people, right? My fellow co-religionists. And the public schools were implementing a program that was viciously anti-Israel. You know, like Israel's responsible for the blood of children, and you know, it's almost like something out of the Middle Ages. And it was run by this Palestinian Arab organization. And the head of the school committee happens to be Jewish in background. He was implementing this program in the Newton schools in a Jewish community. And they were having a hearing about it, and people were coming up and they were angry and very articulate, and they were like demanding that this stop and that this guy resign, and that they were exposing it. And, you know, the thing that I found so fascinating about it was that they just sat there with this blank looks on their face, the entire school board, and they just bring out the little gavel and we're going to go on to the next thing. And it was like, these are people who, this isn't some, you know, we're not talking about the Supreme Court here. We're talking about, you know, local school board, you know, with parents. These people, I assume some of them must have children in the schools, although maybe not. But, you know, the fact that they would behave like that and so arrogantly, I mean, is this what they're being taught? Is this procedure? You know, the left likes to talk about democracy. Well, what about it? I mean, you know, that's what's going on with critical race theory right now all over the country.
It is, and people, I've seen some of the clips, and it is bizarre the way I think they're taught, and I don't know where they learn this. I can say that a lot of professors that go through schools of education, and this is just in my own experience, so I don't know how many places actually do this, but I've taught in, you know, quite a few universities, and the schools of education teach their students critical theory, but they never tell them that's what they're learning. It's all this multiculturalism, all this kind of stuff, but it's filtered through critical theory, but I don't think that they know that the students actually know that's what it is. So they just go and perpetuate it in the schools and everything else. But this,
they give it different names.
Yeah, they give it different names, and that's one of their tactics. Is that watch out? They're not going to call it critical race theory anymore. Pretty soon.
No, that's the Bethel, Maine Institute. You know, they teach them how to engage in this kind of deception and obfuscation.
But it is weird how they can just sit there and say. I heard it one of the clips where the parents were really angry, and they're about, you know, riotously angry, saying you must resign. One of the school board members said, don't respond to them directly. And then they tapped their gavel, and then they called the police, and some people were arrested for trespassing, even though it was a public school meeting. I mean, it's just crazy stuff. But I think they're taught just to stick to their talking points, period. Don't engage in actual real dialogue, because you'll lose.
They look exactly. That's to be avoided, and they learn how to lie, how to deceive. That's what the critical theory is all about. That's what psychology in a way is all about. I think I'm painting a too broad a brush here, but it's the ability to control people emotionally, how to use deception to manipulate people. Not that there isn't a science of the psyche, of course, but there is a certain element to it that is involved with control by state actors of populations and mass control. I mean, the Nazis were very good at that. You could see some of those propaganda films. This is like developing a sort of a national cult and how to remove opposition.
But I think that a defense against that is, and this goes back to the individual. A lot of times, like you were speaking earlier, a lot of times you'll hear an eloquent speaker, but something in your back of your mind is saying, I don't either know if this doesn't make sense or they're wrong. You might even think that they're wrong. Trust your gut on these things, especially when you get confused. Use reason, the proper way, to guide you back to if there's a little alarm going off, listen to it. That's what I'm saying. If you don't understand what they're saying, or if you know that they're playing on your emotions, use your reason when listening to these things. And if they won't debate you in a friendly debate, I'm not saying you have to fight them or anything.
No,
Just say, I want to talk about this. If they won't do it, that's a tell. If they won't have a debate with you.
And always be very pleasant and professional with these people. If they're Fabians, we can be counter Fabians. We can take back the language or redefine things based on what we know to be true over time, through gradually, carefully introducing things, just dropping little seeds. It's like Johnny Appleseed, crossing around to create apple orchards. Anyways, John, I'm reaching toward the end here, and I haven't figured out the technology for how to sign off. So I'll ask you to just sign off because I've got Dooovid coming on. But before you do, let my viewers and listeners know where they could read your articles and any websites you'd like to share.
Okay, I've got quite a few articles on the Catholic World Report, Crisis, Imaginative Conservative. You can just search it and you'll find them. And I'm working on some books. And if you want to contact me or anything, it's revivalwriting.com.
All right, John Gist, I want to thank you as always. We'll do it again soon.
Thank you very much, Charles.
All right. Take care.
You too.
All right. So, and I've got Dooovid coming up. Let me give out the phone number. This is an open lines program. I'm going 2 hours today. So 617-396-4958, 617-396-4958. And I've got Dooovid coming on, I assume, I hope. He usually comes on. Let me just see if he sent me any messages. Yeah, I think he's coming on. Where Dooovid and I tend to discuss issues related to Judaism and Israel and culture and American Judaism and how that intersects with America and the world. And we have had many sharp disagreements since we've been broadcasting together. Sometimes the conversation devolves into yelling matches. I'm going to try to avoid that. I don't feel like yelling today. There is breaking news, apparently. Thank you very much, by the way, on TikTok. A lot of people are responding. Regarding the Maricopa County situation, I have to be careful because right now I am in a venue where you can't talk about that. TikTok allows it, so I'll probably do a TikTok later, like a quick 60-minute piece where I'll update on that once I study it. The program is Monday through Friday, 12 noon to 1 or longer. And I am taking calls. Let me just tell you that the venues that carry the program besides TikTok are YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, DLive, Twitch, VK, Picardo, Daily Motion, and Trovo. I also live stream the program on Podomatic, which automatically then downloads it into iHeartRadio, iTunes, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, and Tune In and a bunch of other sites. So I'm really learning to master the wonderful art of doing an online program. And the program's building, I mean, I have to say, the I am sponsored by myself. I don't have advertisers, at least not yet. And I do that by promoting my books. I've written over 20 books. They're available at Amazon Books. They cover a cross section of issues in politics, culture, economics, and faith. My most recent book is The Satanic Conspiracy. Let me hold it up for the camera. This is what it looks like. I think it's a pretty cool cover, actually. There's my name. And there it is on TikTok, the Satanic Conspiracy. I'm getting a lot of positive feedback for this book. It's more of a pamphlet. It's a short book, very inexpensive. I think you can still get it for free, actually, on the Amazon book page. It costs about $3. And check it out. The Amazon conspiracy, the Satanic Conspiracy by yours truly, Charles Moscowitz. Do I think Biden personally thinks he won or lost? I don't know if Biden, I mean, with due respect, I'm not sure he thinks about too much outside of what to have for lunch. I don't know. Who knows who's in charge over there? I don't mean to be, scalding on that, but frankly, let's be honest. Anyone who views him delivering anything larger than a single sentence, really, you have to conclude that the man has some serious cognitive problems. He never was such a great shakes anyway, but at this stage of the game, I mean, it's we don't know who's really in charge, who's really in the White House. We could speculate. I have no idea. I don't think anyone knows. I mean, I've heard that it's Susan Rice. Who knows? Anyway, was anyone successfully viewing Arizona? Again, I can't talk about Arizona right now because we are on YouTube and that topic is forbidden, but it's all going to come out. It's all going to come out. The truth will emerge. It is moving in that direction, and it is doing so much faster than I thought it would. I thought it would take years. That's all I want to say about that. Again, I am being careful here because we're live on YouTube. So when, I have no idea when. I've heard yesterday Steve Bannon's show, which is the excellent, the war room pandemic. His reporter on this, Boris Epstein, who's really good, really doing a good job, and who's sacrificing a lot to do it, I may add, and who's on the site. He says, let's just be patient. Let's just, they want to have everything perfect because believe me, it's going to come under assault when it comes out. And when I say assault, who knows what that could mean. So they're doing a third check on things. I don't want to use the A word, to make sure that everything is perfect. So I think we have to be patient. It could take another month. It may take till the rest of the end of this year. My understanding, according to Boris Epstein's estimate, is that we're looking at maybe 2 weeks to a month. Bannon and I are leading this? No, I don't think that's true. I think that the American people are leading it. I think that there are polls that indicate that, was it 63% of all Americans believe that there was, quote, of all Republicans, excuse me, believe that there were improprieties on November 3rd of last year. I want to be careful here. I think that large numbers of independents and Democrats also believe that. They put aside politics and they took a look at the events of the day and they say, this wasn't kosher on so many levels. I don't want to get into it. I've written a couple of books on the topic. Go to my book page. I'm not trying to necessarily sell books, although hey, I sponsor the show myself, so The books are there. But you can check them out. I've written, I think, 2 books, if not 3, on this topic. So check out, just put my name in the server, Charles Moscowitz at Amazon Books, and you'll see them come out. Now, I don't see where Dooovid is. I don't know if he's coming on. I mean, let me just check my Facebook page. I mean, to see if he tried to get in touch with me. Maybe, I know that last week he was having a blackout. He's in Detroit due to the hurricane winds that whipped through that poor city. Let's see if he's trying to reach me. I don't see him. Let me just see, David Calton. Yeah, so sign in. All right, so let me let me just go noon. Let me just, yeah, Dooovid is coming on. Let me just try to get him to sign in. Let me send. It's amazing what you can do now with this technology. Here he is. Nope, he's not there yet. All right, so we will be coming up shortly. Will be Dooovid, and Dooovid and I, as mentioned, we have discussed, and there he is, issues of Judaism and America, and here he is. Hi, Dooovid. How are you?
Hey, awesome, Charles. Can we start in 2 minutes? I apologize. Or did you already go live?
We're already live, but that's okay, Dooovid. You want to step away? That's fine.
Okay, I just mentioned that I had Lipton Matthews from the Mises Institute from Jamaica.
Yeah.
Conservative, libertarian person with a channel, actually interviewing very interesting guests. He had Kaufman on from the White Fragility. I mean, the White. I have the book on my shelf. Yeah, Charles Murray. No, the
Charles Murray. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, he's an academic, and he was he's not a fellow, but he's writing for the Van Mises Institute. So he's a libertarian, economic. So I had him on at 10, and then started a few minutes late. We went on for like 2 hours, and we were talking afterwards. I didn't come to the stream. So if you want to talk for like 2-3 minutes, I use the restroom and change my laundry. I'll be back in 2 minutes.
Okay, then. No problem. Being the internet, we can do this kind of thing. Let me just swing open the phone lines. 617-396-4958. 617-396-4958. I want to again thank my guest in the first hour, that being John Gist, who just a solid thinker. He discusses philosophical issues from a Catholic perspective. He's a professor. He writes for Crisis Magazine. His latest article is Nature's God and the Threat to the West, Catholics and Nature's God. And we discussed the kind of one of the major Catholic theologians and thinkers, that being St. Thomas Aquinas, and his views on natural law. He also was the author of the concept of just war, which I think is very interesting, or just war theory. When is it just? When is it legal? When is it lawful, as it were, for a nation to go to war? And that's interesting. And of course, we also discussed the overall effects of critical theory generally, critical race theory specifically, how they're all linked to this Marxist group of sociologists who operated at Columbia University in the 1950s, called the Frankfurt Institute, or part of it, and how it really is a goal to overthrow the social order and replace it with a Marxist paradigm of collectivism, that we are not, there's something prejudiced and wrong about placing our own individual consciousness and our own self-interest first, and that the idea is to surrender that, to sublimate that, to sacrifice that for the good of others, allegedly, which it isn't, and become collectivized. John Gist points out that the individual, the sovereign individual under God, is generally working toward betterment of society just by nature. The common good, so-called. It's a Catholic concept, but it's one that I think is quite apt and quite appropriate. It's also a Jewish concept in that we believe in mitzvahs, doing, preparing the world, doing good. But we recognize it as a part of an inherent part, an aspect of human nature. You don't need to have the power of government do it, especially when the power of government operates under the assumption that people aren't going to do it and don't want to do it by nature, which we do. So, Dooovid, what's going on?
Hey, great. Yeah, I was really excited. I had a good stream. People check it out. Lipton Matthews, a very interesting man. You check out his channel. He's been doing a few interviews a week, and he's had a lot of academics, economics, and a lot of people about intelligence and culture and cultural differences. And he's been attacking, critical race theory and Black Lives Matter a little bit. And I guess this man is African American. Might carry a little bit more weight in what he was saying. Week in review, I was talking a lot, at the foam show here. I went back for the first time to a major convention in Metro Detroit, the foam show. Hundreds of suppliers of foam related materials. I guess manufacturing from the last time I heard, over 50% of all global manufacture is the automobile. So if you're in manufacturing, for economic capitalistic purposes, you want to get your product into the automobile because that's the pinnacle of all manufacture. And foam is basically just air, gas injected into a product, and it makes it more lightweight. So foam has become very popular in Metro Detroit for the automotive industry because of cafe standards trying to limit emissions. The best way to do that currently is to make the vehicle a lighter weight. And then but kind of pessimistic, maybe just you're talking about the role of government, but the Surfside building collapse and maybe increased crime and what's happening over the world. Tisha B'Av's coming up in a time of mourning, and it just seems like society's coming apart, and we may not be able to pull things together on the infrastructure level. I think over half of America's infrastructure is beyond its usable life. It's saying half of the infrastructure in America we should not be using anymore. Should have already been replaced. And I actually had someone from Boston who was talking like half of the buildings in Boston are past their usable life. It doesn't mean there's going to be, God forbid, like a collapse like in Florida, but it means over half of the buildings in Boston, in reality, should be demolished and rebuilt. And it's almost impossible that that's going to happen. And if it's like the reverse Flynn effect, the changes in the labor force, does the labor force, even if Biden was somehow miraculously able to pull America together and everyone wanted to work together, what you're saying, like, as libertarians or conservatives, the role of government that we're not even leaning towards, but even somehow society all came together and wanted to work together to fix the infrastructure. If you trust the markets, is the labor force even there to do it? So these are the kind of things I was, talking about, but whatever you want to talk about is fine.
All right. I mean, I can think of two things I'd like to talk about and as derived from what you're saying. And the first one actually has to do with the infrastructure and building. And this is a libertarian principle that I've actually, I believe, read about and interviewed someone. And it does have to do with Boston. You say that the Boston infrastructure, and that means buildings, roads, bridges, everything is halfway past its lifespan, and that is entering into a serious situation of decay. It makes me think that if you go to Boston now, and you're in downtown Boston, even in neighborhoods of Boston, the structures that are the best are the ones that were built before 1920. They tend to be even like 19th century and early 20th century structures. the houses, the office buildings, the apartment buildings, they're very high standards, and they're not falling apart. If anything, they're just as good as ever. The buildings that are reaching their end of life are the more modern buildings. And I think the reason for that, and this has been discussed by people actually at the von Mises Institute, I think I interviewed someone there a long time ago, is because starting in the 1920s, you had state and federal, but I think there's probably more state construction standards put in, laws put in, directives put in by agencies, not necessarily laws passed by the state legislature. And that those on the surface were meant to address problems in construction. But the fact is that what they did was they lowered the standards across the board. Everyone had to conform to a certain standard, but that standard was lowered. And the result was that buildings were constructed that were not as good as previous. The walls were thinner, the material was cheaper, the entire infrastructure was shoddier, because they could do it, because they could get away with it, because they were meeting these lowered standards. So in a way, it kind of goes against such government regulation, because if a company has to maintain standards that have to compete on the open market, and people want to have an excellent building, then they're going to increase, they're not going to dumb it down. They're not going to build down to the lowest standard. They're going to actually make it better. So that's my thought on the infrastructure thing. What you're talking about in terms of what's going on around the world.
Can I interject real quick?
Sure.
I mean, just historically, the reasons that you gave are probably correct, and there's others. It just that like the roads were majority built after World War II. It was Truman's plan, like the highway systems were mostly built in the 50s.
Yeah.
And most of the buildings, like strip malls, suburbs, office buildings, were built in the 70s and 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Just when people, the urbanization and people started moving out to the suburbs. And if in Florida, where it was supposed to be the 40-year engineering check, where they did it, and it was like the building's in trouble, and they had to put $15 million in. But if you use the 40-year life cycle of buildings, most of the places like around Boston, downtown, the suburbs, were built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that means that a lot of it is already 10, 15 years past their useful life cycle. And a lot of it is approaching or moving past its useful life cycle, not even added on what you're talking about, regulation or inferior quality, that even the stuff that was made in good quality just has a useful life cycle, and it's past it.
I understand that, but it was built downward toward a standard that was lowered, and so these things are falling apart.
Well, anyway, so even if they were built at a really good standard, they still have a useful life cycle,
the buildings
the things built a long time ago.
I understand, but the things that were built before the 20s, they seem to, at least in Boston, and again, I'm not an expert on the topic, hardly, but my observation is that these are the best structures in the city, and that they don't seem to have a life cycle. Some of them were built even in colonial times, and they're still sound. But I want to move on to the international question you brought up. There is great unrest around the world. You have the communist regime in Cuba being, for the first time, tattered by an uprising. And they're cracking down like the communists in China did during Tiananmen Square. I don't know if it's that bad. I don't think they're mowing people down with tanks yet, but apparently they are moving in like a communist country does, and they're cracking down on dissent, and it's a huge human rights crisis. You've got crisis in Haiti with the assassination of a Juvenal Moise under situations that are interesting, and there's a lot of theory around that, including some conspiracy theory. I'm not going to get into it. But let's just say that Juvenal Moise was a friend of Trump's. You've got unrest, of course, in Venezuela. You've got unrest in South Africa, where the former president, Zuma, was arrested, and he had been president for 9 years. And now you have people hitting the street. And by the way, he also was a friend of Trump's, I understand. you've got unrest certainly in Hong Kong, and there's just the phenomena around the world. France they say, might be nearing a civil war in terms of unrest. England, because maybe that might have to do with the pandemic. I don't know, but there's a lot of unsettled stuff going on.
If it's related to the collapse of the infrastructure, I mean, one thing that, like, I'm a civil engineer, I knew about the collapsing infrastructure. Like, we make health reports, and the engineers have been telling us that for decades, and just the death.
Are you talking about the Surfside thing, or?
Well, I'm saying everywhere in Michigan, like the bridges across the U.S., the roads, like generically, most states have they give a health report, and you have like C, D level of like even dams and bridges and buildings that this is well known in the engineering community, like in Michigan, because of the frost thaw cycle, the roads are so bad that everyone knows about it. But the bad state of American infrastructure is extremely well known in the engineering world, and people have been talking about it. And the infrastructure plan, the government throwing money at it, is unlikely to do anything. Last week I couldn't stream because of power outage, and just something simple like cutting the trees. That that there's severe wind, and due to the economic structure, usually the trees fall, and then they fix the power afterwards, and due to incompetence or inability to work together. And it's probably going to get worse. So it's saying, like, I mean, Charles isn't an engineer, but like, had you went to any engineering school, there's a way to grade infrastructure, and it's bad. And it's probably coupled together with what you're saying, that the economic fallout, political fallout, social lack of social cohesion, moral decay, coupled with crumbling infrastructure. Maybe economic decline, the global supply chain.
I don't think
that just Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When people are in a more desperate situation, they're more likely to do desperate things. And I think that's largely what's causing what we're seeing around the world.
Well, I'm not sure that infrastructure is the main cause.
It's just a minor. No, I'm saying, but it's a minor. It's a minor sign of what you're talking about.
And in Cuba and in South Africa and elsewhere.
I mean, Cuba, they say, like, you can't get a refrigerator. Like in Cuba, people still have like refrigerators.
But that's not because of infrastructure. That's because of communism. I think
think like blackouts. By saying, like, okay, I had a blackout here for 24 hours. In Cuba, you have a blackout, and it might take a week or a month to get your power out. In certain areas, they might never get their power back.
Detroit's a pretty poorly managed city, and so perhaps parts of it are completely.
But it is somewhat related.
Okay, fine.
But now, I mean, you're right. The issues you're talking about are more important than infrastructure.
I'm talking about I want to look at the political and social element of this. I wonder if this is not a part of, I want to be careful here, but is it not a part of the Trump movement, the Brexit movement, the movement by people to challenge the ruling class in their countries, this international oriented, oligarchical, illuminated, amoral system of what C. Wright Mills called power elites. Is this part? I mean, I think that the election of Trump was that. I think Brexit was that. And I'm wondering if this isn't more of the same. Are people starting to overthrow these oligarchies and demand a return of sovereignty to the people? I mean, I know I'm speaking in simplistic terms here, but that's what I'm wondering. That's what I think. I don't know that, but I sense.
I agree. But you're saying, like, if you mean like revolution and violence, like you've talked like Black Lives Matters or George Floyd protest or what's happening in Cuba or South Africa, as opposed to a political effort that the system could be fixed, as opposed to, God forbid, like, the Talmud says the 70-year cycle of, boom and bust, like that likely we're going to reach a world war situation, that people are calling for blood. Like, it's not like, Trump is going to come in and fix the infrastructure. And, I'm not as bullish on Trump as you were. I think Trump was, I saw your other guest, Fisher. I watched that this morning. But like, Trump was more self-promotion and just trying to portray that image than actually being that image, but like Trump is
He
the
had all the
builder.
old cliches against Trump. I mean, he probably manufactured.
Well, I mean, he was beyond, but I'm saying that Trump, like Trump is a builder that could have fixed America's infrastructure, that he failed.
He had a lot of opposition. Now,
I mean, I don't want to get into
I don't want to get
Trump,
into that either.
into the personal Trump, like who was to blame, but at the point that that people are going to be in the street calling for blood.
Yeah.
They're not going to be
But
that support
I
a
get
candidate
that,
who
and I
could
hope
rebuild
not.
the infrastructure.
But
People
I
are in
don't
the
think
street
that
calling for
I'm
blood.
not
I mean, you
connected.
don't agree with my assessment. Like
No,
it's
what I
almost
don't-
past the point where we're going to get behind the person who could fix our system. People are in the street and they want to see
So, but
blood.
what I
God
don't
forbid.
agree with is no, I don't think people are going to be on the street looking for blood who are part of the Trump movement.
I'm
The
saying
BLM
I'm saying society-wise that when you talked about Cuba and South Africa.
Thank you very much. The BLM people, that is not what I'm talking about. That is a manufactured turf group that was created by corporate interest in a lab somewhere. That was to fan the flames of division and racism in this country. It had nothing to do with what I'm talking about here, which is a genuine movement.
You're talking about the overthrow of the oligarchs.
You're
talking like
African Americans
calling for blood
actually supported Trump more than we know, and that they are part of this movement of reasserting sovereignty and not getting caught up in the oligarchic dialectic that divides us and creates, sort of the same kind of race identity consciousness that that philosophical ideas like critical race theory is trying to do. This is a rejection of that. This is saying, hey, we're all brothers in that we all are trying to assert our sovereign rights as citizens, whether we agree with each other on particulars or not. This is a movement that is the opposite to these. I mean, Antifa and BLM, they're just shock troops for the Democratic Party, which is run by oligarchs and corporations. That's just a phony street theater that is burning Black neighborhoods, looting Black businesses, and killing Black people. That's not anything that actually is genuine. And that's,
I mean, you're a man of history. I say, like, no, I mean, calling for blood is genuine, like a peaceful removal of the oligarchs or restoration of justice to the people very rarely happens in history, as opposed to the masses becoming dissatisfied with the structure in revolution and calling for blood. That is actually human nature, and that is historically what we usually see. That you could be idealistically and hope that somehow everyone's going to get together and we're going to restore power to the people. But when does that happen in history? Like a handful of times, as opposed to calling for blood and revolution. How many times does that happen in history? A lot of times.
Look, you may be right that it could actually come down to that. I don't think so. I pray it doesn't.
When I say human nature, that's more likely than what you're saying. I mean, as a man of history,
and unique nation.
Well, you say as a man of history, which one's even more likely?
Rights derive from the citizen and from God, and that is a system that we have upheld for 200 years. We didn't need to have revolutions because we controlled the power as sovereign citizens under God, and that we had a government that exercised limited powers in charge of protecting those God-given rights. That's the American philosophy. That is the philosophy embraced in the Declaration of Independence. And the practice of that philosophy, to the extent that we've been able to do it, which is imperfect, has been why we haven't needed revolutions, because we have the sovereignty, we have the rights. What I'm suggesting is that those rights are not guaranteed. You have to fight for them, every day, because they don't grow on trees. You have to exercise them, and that we've had some setbacks recently. I don't want to point a particular finger to a recent event that happened last November 3rd, because I could get banned on YouTube. But I will just say that the oligarchs, what C. Wright Mills called the power elite, which is a combination of government and big corporations internationally, they are continuing to assert their power, and we're continuing to challenge it. Do you need to have a violent revolution to overtake it? No, I don't think so. I mean, you could have a violent revolution that's what they want. They'll co-opt the violent revolution like they did in the French Revolution. The French Revolution itself, I'm just going to do a little history here, if you don't mind. It was actually completely peaceful. What happened in 1789 was King Louis XVI called for a national assembly and agreed to becoming a constitutional monarch. He stepped down from absolute power. Whether he wanted to do it or not is another question, but the fact is that's what he did. And it happened without a single shot. It was completely peaceful. And then that revolution, if you will, which was restoring sovereign power and recognizing sovereign power to the French people, and which was inspired by the American Revolution, that was subverted by and co-opted by an elite that worked underground and that eventually overthrew that regime 3 years later and replaced it with the Reign of Terror, which is the world's first communist revolution. Now, I just want to make one more quick note about the French Revolution. In the 1970s, when the Nixon administration was in conversation with the communist Chinese, Chou Enlai, Mao Zedong, they were in their meeting with them. Nixon was there. He was getting ready to meet with Mao. And there was a Nixon operative, like an aide. They were hanging out in the anteroom talking, trying to, everybody was running a little late. And Chou Enlai was there. He was the prime minister, the kind of the intellect of the communist movement at the time. And this aide asked Chou Enlai, he goes, they're talking history. He's like, what did you think of the French Revolution? And Chou Enlai's answer was, it's too soon to tell. You get my drift? In other words, the communist movement, which is an oligarchic, top-down controlled international movement, they are moving forward, taking advantage of situations as they arise, where people rise up, and they craft it and mold it in a way that suits their authoritarian agenda, because they ultimately do see total control. I mean, another example would have been the Arab Spring. Remember that? Started out with people simply demanding sovereign rights in their country. It started in Tunisia, actually. But it would be co-opted by the authoritarians, like the secret Muslim Brotherhood, who would come in and they would use the disorder that was resulting from that to seize total control and to send the Arab countries backward until eventually you had civil war in Syria and you had the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and it was all backed by Obama, by the way. So yeah, these are very dangerous situations, but the genuine movement of the people, we have to remember, is not any of that, and that we have to come together as sovereign citizens, even if we don't agree with each other on particulars, to fight for natural rights. I just interviewed, I don't know if you heard my interview with John Gist. He's a Catholic thinker and intellectual, and we talked about these ideas of natural law. So that's what I see happening in the world right now, to get back to the point. That's what these uprisings are all about. It's the power of sovereign people to assert their right against these illuminated internationalist oligarchs. And that could happen here. I don't think violently, but I think it's being done here by using our system of government, our court system, our ability to examine and audit, if you will, we won't say more, what our process is, and to use our system of justice to get justice and to get truth. Anyway, what else is on your mind? What's happening in the Jewish world?
Well, just one last thing that we could talk about, because my guest, Lipton Matthews, he was referencing this article about COVID lockdowns and mass hysteria. And I'd read those famous books, I think Hoffman, or on mass hysteria. And no, unfortunately, I'm more pessimistic and think that violence is the mainstream strategy, that the mass of humankind could rally together behind ideas is, that's what we hope for in as religious people, but historically people are acting, so to say, according to plan, and that means that society starts falling apart, and then you see revolutions and people choose the path of violence, and as hysteria increases, God forbid, people make less rational decisions. Just Maslow's hierarchy, as people are functioning at the higher levels of the hierarchy that already have the security and basic needs met for, are less likely to act in violence or make bad decisions. But as people reach a greater state of need, that they're more likely to make rash decisions. And unfortunately, like, just kind of pessimistic and saying like, no, I mean, God forbid, I'm seeing bad things. I wish I didn't see bad things. Like, I'd like to agree with you. I'd like to be idealistic, but I'm just not seeing it. And unfortunately, I do think violence is the natural human reaction, and that what you're saying is not actually the natural human reaction, that it would take some sort of higher level thinking or higher purpose to cause people to not choose the natural human reaction, which is violence. And it relates, maybe, God forbid, to how we look at Israel in terms of how you look at violence as the natural human reaction to people's dreams and ideals not being met.
Look, I reject that, Dooovid. I mean, it's not because I'm idealistic. I recognize the forces of violence and how they could be manipulated and created by people who gain from them and who have an interest in them. But I think I do believe in the concept of nonviolent resistance and disobedience. That's what was advocated by the late, great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. That was advocated by Gandhi. That was advocated by Henry David Thoreau in his book, Walden, which I read many years ago. And that's what happened, for example, in Europe during the fall of the Soviet Union. The Baltic states became independent because everybody would stand up, apparently, and they would sing. The singing revolution, you've heard of that, right? In Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, people, they just said, we're not going to cooperate with this government anymore. We're not going to go along with the game. We're not going to do it. And they were able to remove the Soviet government, puppet states, and gain freedom. So I think that people don't need to, this country has not had to do that. We've had violent instances, usually inspired by people operating behind the scenes who want war and who want violence and who whip people's emotions up and create collective consciousness. Because when people start to join a violent mob, they're no longer thinking for themselves. They become a part of a collective. And collectivism is the ultimate goal of communism. So no, I don't think we need to have violence. I don't think
I'm just disagreeing that they don't need to be whipped up by bad actors. Like if we're like a base Hillel, base Shammai debate on how dark true human nature is, or Mensch's Lao Tzu, on what's the true human nature, I don't think you need bad actors to whip people up. The natural tendency, it's like man is born, wild ass, and the natural order is to steal and to want to, conduct violence upon people.
Yeah, and we also have
you don't need bad actors to whip people up to feel like that.
We have we're not animals, Dooovid, bound to nature.
I mean, we are human. We are animals. That's what we're saying. Like we are animals.
We're also spiritual beings created in the image of God. Are you a Jew? Don't you believe that God created man in his image?
Well, so I have a body which is an animal, and I have a soul.
And you also have
the natural
soul.
tendency of the body is to tell me to act as an animal. To
kill someone. That's the thing that's.
You don't need any bad actor to tell the body to act the way that the body naturally wants to act. You have the power of the soul. Every individual has a soul that could.
My natural inclination might be to snap your head off, but I have the ability to have reason. I have a soul. I have a consciousness. I was created in God's image. As a human being, you have the dual element of the animal side, but you also have the spiritual side. The soul is there. That's what Judaism teaches. That's what I believe. And that's what nature teaches. When I look at, it's not in our best interest. It would be in our best interest to go next door to our neighbor who has more than we do and just slaughter them and keep all their property. But we don't do that because we are rational human beings who can think and and have the ability to, engage in cognitively. And so when you have the violent element, it is manipulated by unnatural forces that have something to gain by that, and who then appeal to the animal side of us so that we can then forget our rational side. Now, that's not to say that a situation can't devolve to such a degree that you do ultimately have to have violence to stop something from happening. Jews who resisted the Nazi Holocaust I mean, I remember interviewing this guy who had, he was a Jew who had escaped from Auschwitz during World War II, and he became part of a partisan group made up of Jews and non-Jews who were resisting the Nazis and who were out killing Nazis and shooting people to stop the convoys. And the one thing they didn't have enough of course, was guns besides food. But that to me is justified. I mean, that's what St. Thomas Aquinas talks about when he talks about just war. So I'm not a pacifist. I understand that there are situations where freedom has been so lost that that's the last resort. I don't think that is the case in the United States. Like, I don't think last summer, because of the death of George Floyd, who was not a very good character, as we know, and who, you could say it was manslaughter. It certainly was police abuse. But why that would justify people looting Black businesses, burning Black neighborhoods, and killing Black people, because Black people in this country aren't that oppressed that would be necessary. I don't believe that they are. I think that was manipulated. There was no reason for that. That wasn't something that happened organically. That was something that was stage managed by people, I think, who saw this as a way to stop Trump, quite frankly. That's my opinion. I have no idea. I don't know the inner workings. I don't know the motivation. But what I do know is that organization, Black Lives Matter, was a front group that was financed by a man whose name is similar to the Yiddish word Soros. Let's leave it at that. And that it was an agenda by international establishment people to stop the will of the American people. And that would have been to have elected Trump. And I think that had everything to do with it. I think that had everything to do with a lot of violent instances that occur in the world. It's not natural. It's a last resort. So you and I disagree on that. Not that I'm some kind of a wide-eyed.
Ages. I mean, Perkiavos clearly says that don't wish the downfall of the government, because if it wasn't for the government, people would be swallowing each other alive. Plenty of state man is born a natural beast. I mean, when you get angry, all people desire to kill. That is the natural inclination. Well, it's because we have a logical facility to control our action. But as society breaks down, this natural desire to steal and kill without law and order, without the semi-structure of, you don't need bad actors to convince people to kill and steal. That's inborn in the human when we take birth, and only when people use the soul to acclimate itself. And say even your belief is contrary to a Judaic system, is saying the natural body inclination tells us to do bad things, and only by coming to the power of the soul can we overcome the animal body to act in a good way. And as society breaks down, people lose the ability to follow the rational advice of the soul and will act the way that the body does. And God forbid the body says steal and kill. And all people, when, and if you want Aristotelian on it, yes, all people are animals, all people steal and kill unless they use the rational faculties of the soul to control ourselves and act in proper behavior. And you don't need bad actors for people to act like animals.
All right, let me be more precise, Dooovid. Yes, of course, people are going to kill on their own. You have murder, you've got all kinds of motivations for that. They're not responding to bad actors. They are bad actors. They are, they have resorted to the amoral animal element in their being.
Well, the natural human animal. I mean, saying you have the soul, but the natural human it's not the bad action. It's the natural human animal that we all are that causes people to act like this. Not some special bad element. The natural human.
I don't want to get back on the merry-go-round, but yes, there is a natural element, but there's also the natural element that we have a soul, that which separates us from the animal kingdom. We understand reason. We understand logic. We understand God. We can know God. We can know the spiritual side of life. We have a bigger purpose in life than just fulfilling our natural urges. That's also natural. Both things are natural. And we balance those things based on a lot of complicated factors, including self-interest. I'm not talking about those who succumb to that natural urge and commit crimes, including murder. and violence. I'm talking about organized movements that when you take a look at them, there's no rational reason for them engaging in violence. Now, the people that are rebelling right now in Havana, there might be some violence there, but they have a rational reason because they've reached a point of it's a last resort. Communism has ripped them and shredded any semblance of individual freedom. And so, there's no other choice. The communists have a monopoly on everything in that country, including arms and weaponry. And so the only way to go about it is to challenge them. The American revolutionaries ultimately had no other choice than to form an army under George Washington, declare independence, and prepare to fight a British invasion, which happened. So, I'm not a pacifist here, but I'm pointing out that some of these violent movements, we can take a look at whether or not they have a legitimate and just reason to commit violence. And if they don't, then you have to ask yourself, who's behind it? Who gains? Like the Latin expression, cui bono, who benefits? And I would apply that standard to people like Antifa and BLM, because
I don't disagree, but I'm saying that you're saying that the breakdown of society, if it's infrastructure, economics, law and order, will just make people acting in the natural animalistic way much more likely, and bad actors will obviously make it worse. But that's why I open talking about the infrastructure and these economic and political breakdown of law and order is that unfortunately, I think it's going to get worse.
Okay, well, that's awfully pessimistic. I mean, it may get worse before it gets better. I hope
it gets better. I agree with that. Like it's going to get worse before it gets better. And in the near short term, I think what God forbid's happening in South Africa, in Cuba, they even say it's likely to happen here. God forbid.
Yeah, it could, and I think that. But I don't
just
think
Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I mean, you don't think that
this
just
country doesn't have
people
that
in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. As more people in America have their basic needs less and less secure, that they're going to make worse and worse decisions. God forbid.
Well, if their needs are made less and less secure, that would be done. I think that would be deliberately, because we're a country of plenty and we don't have insecurity. Anyway, Dooovid, let's move on to discuss Jewish themes. What's happening in Israel? What's happening in the Jewish world?
So the government's still hanging on by a thread. It looks like that family reunification bill was not renewed, which God forbid, in my understanding, prevents Palestinians who marry Israeli women from gaining Jewish Israeli citizen. Uniquely singles out Palestinians or maybe a few other nations from the possibility of gaining U.S. citizenship. So actually had relatively wide support, but the right-wing opposition that's now Likud refused to back it, and Ram, the Arab parties, so that didn't pass. The COVID.
So what happens now in Israel? So if a Palestinian marries an Israeli, then a Palestinian, as in someone on the West Bank and Gaza, they can then become an Israeli citizen?
I guess so. So now I guess the path to citizenship has been reopened up to Palestinians. So the bill was an emergency measure that had been renewed every year.
Reopened up? I don't think it was ever opened up, but it's
no, it was since 2003. I mean, the historical measure was if you marry a Jew, you could have a path to citizenship in Israel. And then 2003, after whatever Lebanon War, whatever the Intifada, that period, they started passing this bill that closed the path to citizenship through marriage to Palestinians. And so, I mean, that's not a big deal in Israeli politics. The number of Palestinians that have the path of citizenship now open to them, it was just a minor issue that.
Tiny number. And by the way, what is the path to citizenship in Israel? If let's say you are Palestinian and you have an Israeli spouse and you want to become an Israeli citizen, you want to move to Israel, what is the path to citizenship? Is it in this country, for example, to become a citizen, I think there are some standards in terms of you have to study, you have to take a course, you have to pass a test to see if you understand basic American civics. and you also have to take a loyalty oath to the country. Is that the case in Israel? Would a Palestinian married to an Israeli be required to do that? Do they have to take a loyalty oath?
I didn't look into it, but yeah, there's probably a process like in America where, if you're married to an American, you could, move here as a resident alien and then, gain citizenship or privileges through doing these certain things. So I think it's similar, but I don't know the exact where, so if you marry a Jewish or Israeli woman that that you could move to Israel, and then to actually gain Israeli citizenship requires a higher level of living there as a resident. I don't even know the exact details. That's minor. The big thing now happening in Israel is I think Avigdor Lieberman has been put in charge of one of the economic commissions, and without legislation needed from the Knesset, just through his discretionary powers, the head of I have to someone just do a Google search of what exact commission he's in charge of. He's funneling money away from Haredim and stopping a lot of these welfare programs or economic programs that benefit Haredim, and he's making very wild remarks, at least according to Haredim, about the role that Haredim play in society, and it's had immediate economic impacts because he's had discretionary authority to immediately end some of these financial programs, and there's a lot of pushback and a lot of pressure that it could end the coalition, because there's some Orthodox element that are part of the coalition that think it's too much, and actually he's offered to ironically, like Kollel people getting funding for the government, that they'll end the Kollel funding from the ultra Orthodox, but keep the Kollel funding for the the Dati people who promote serving in the army. So that's been a big issue, but Israel's relatively functioning because the ministers are in place, so they have the coalition, and the ministers have been approved and have been put into office, and so they have a budget and they could administer the state, and as of now, none of these disputes have caused what would be a call for new elections, which would leave Bennett as perpetual prime minister. And I'll let you comment on that, and then I'll give you an update on the COVID-19 situation in Israel that could be, concerning. The Pfizer CEO has said that you probably need a third booster shot. And Israel, I think today, had 700 cases of COVID-19, and they said half of the cases were in people that have already been vaccinated, and God forbid, 60% of the people that are now in severe, ICU units are people that already had the vaccine. So Pfizer is estimating that it's about 6 months for the vaccine to lose its efficacy. And, so Israel was one of the first nations in the world with the Pfizer vaccine. And a lot of the people now are approaching past the 6 months. And so the COVID situation in Israel, could be concerning. And I think in America, it might also be upticking. Just to mention, like I went to the foam show. I've chosen not to get the vaccine, but I'm still very careful, social distancing and wearing a mask. I would say at the foam show, it wasn't that packed because, foam's not that interesting, but less than 10% of people were wearing masks. And my guess is that, probably a lot of those people weren't vaccinated. Here in America. We have the honor system, but I think you're going to see an uptick here, and probably mostly be among unvaccinated people. And if the data coming from Israel is accurate, could be the vaccines after 6 months. Are going to need a booster shot, or God forbid, it could be the Delta or Delta Plus variant now is infecting people and even causing serious disease in people who have been previously vaccinated. Dr. Fauci pushed back on the data coming from Israel and said it still needed more study. And he was like, the CDC makes decisions, not the CEO of Pfizer. But like, honestly, I think the CEO of Pfizer probably knows better than Fauci.
What vaccine did they use in Israel?
They had the Pfizer vaccine, which is supposedly
they
the
had
best
Pfizer.
Of them. Israel almost exclusively used the Pfizer vaccine, which was known to be the best of all of them. Although there's different ones of the variants have different.
They say that the Pfizer vaccine is proving to be effective against the Delta variant.
I'm
Or
not
am I
sure the, I
wrong?
mean, there was today's, Times of Israel that said 60% of the severe disease in Israel right now is among people who've already had the vaccine.
Okay, because my understanding is that a large portion of the Israelis took the Russian vaccine, not Pfizer, and that the Pfizer vaccine, according to the CDC as of now, is effective in terms of protecting against the Delta variant. That the CDC disagrees with Pfizer in that the vaccine won't be effective after 6 months. They say it's going to be at least a year, if not longer. And my question to you is, why haven't you gotten the vaccine? Not that it's any of my business.
Well, I mean, I'm not anti-vaxxer, but I think because it's still under emergency use,
Okay.
and I'm capable of wearing a mask and social distancing. And I think, theoretically, one thing I noticed that the foam convention, usually these shows are packed with Chinese and Chinese businessmen and Chinese companies. There were almost no Chinese people here. And first I thought maybe it was something diplomatic. And then I thought it's more likely that it's because China has more strict COVID standards, and the Chinese people, if they came here,
Right.
wouldn't be able to go back to China without quarantining. But coming from China, you're supposed to beat viruses not through vaccines, but through social distancing and wearing masks. And that having everybody vaccine, it's not even clear that that is going to work in the first place. And that what we were supposed to do from the beginning was to have a lockdown, have masks and social distancing until the virus was no longer in circulation, and not that we were going to have vaccines and just not worry about it. So of that matter, like scientifically, I think it's a superior method to wear masks and social distance than the vaccine. And the vaccine is still under emergency usage. And so, like, if you have, I didn't tell, I mean, I encourage people to get vaccinated, especially if you're in a situation. But my situation, I don't have, my work, and God forbid, my lack of a family doesn't makes it very easy for me to keep social distance and have and wear masks. So I don't see why I would want to take an emergency usage vaccine.
No, well, it's a personal choice. I've taken the vaccine. I don't either condone or condemn it. I think that it's a personal choice. So far, so good.
Well, I'm still wearing my mask. As I said, like, the numbers at the show, like less than 10% of people were wearing masks.
Oh, and they probably
Statistically,
get
only
vaccinated.
about 60% of people in Michigan are vaccinated. So if the honor system now, like I went to the drugstore yesterday to get a prescription for my mother, and it said, as per CDC guideline, if you're vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask.
Right.
And, so the honor system, like Doovid's an honorable man, and I'm wearing my mask. And, but like whether, statistically, like, no, I mean, presumably there's a large amount of people that aren't vaccinated
And
that aren't wearing their masks. And I think America now, we're back over 25,000 cases a day. There's been,
in some places, and in Massachusetts,
I mean,
it's still-
total in the US, it was
yeah,
25,000.
Massachusetts is very highly vaccinated. We have a lot of medical people here. It's a very science-oriented society here. And I don't wear the mask anymore. I mean, unless I'm with a family member, frankly, who insists on that I wear it, in which case I will. But
Are you still more cognizant in social distancing?
well, I never really socially got close to people anyways. I was never a big fan of shaking hands. I mean, I don't go to crowds. One of the things that I do besides writing and my business is that I used to take Uber passengers in the morning. I love Uber. And I've gotten back to doing it, but only delivering. I haven't yet had passengers. And I'm now thinking about whether or not I should. I want to, but I'm trying to weigh and measure how that would happen. And if I did, I probably would wear a mask. Anyway, Dooovid, we're reaching toward the end. What do you have coming up on your show? Any new you want to talk about any of your, anything happening?
So yeah, I mean, today I had Lipton Matthews, and it was a very good conversation.
Good.
And we talked about Africa and development and IQ and a whole various of issues. And the von Mises, he talked about libertarian economics and how it applies. And so encourage people, if they're interested, to check that out.
That's on YouTube?
That's on my YouTube channel.
Okay.
from earlier today. The power outages last week, it was actually supposed to be last week. This Sunday is, Tisha B'Av, the very serious fast day. So I usually do a week in review, but this week I've canceled it because it would be fasting till sundown. And, it'd be probably too weak to do it. I appeared on Luke Ford this week. We talked about Tikkun Olam and the history of Tikkun Olam. And it was a pretty interesting stream. I think he had to take it down from YouTube and put it up maybe on his BitChute or alternative. We looked at an article, the origin of the idea. And, depending on how you define Tikkun Olam, basically all Jews hold of the concept of Tikkun Olam. Even like Maimonides mentions it. It's just, what is it? Like that. I think all rational Jews
Repair
believe
the
that,
world.
well, all rational Jews believe that being Jewish is something that largely is beneficial to the whole world and all the people who live in the world.
If you fulfill
And
the
just the nature about what exactly it is that we do that causes that to be, could be, because liberal Jews have
we
maybe
know
taken.
God. We fulfill the Torah. Anyway, Dooovid, thanks so much for joining me. I gotta go.
Okay, yeah, great. Have a great day.
All right, you too. Thank you.